Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Melissa, the PhD candidate for the TALOS second research topic on classifying and naming objects. And today I'll be talking about an ontological dataset I created concerning the depiction of literacy iconography on attic painted vases. So I apologize for continuing to harp on this previous research that isn't directly related to my PhD topic, but I found that practicing working with ontologies and TEDI with vase painting, a sphere within archaeology I'm more accustomed to working in, is making it easier than if I was just learning the technology as well as working with new material types. But don't worry, this ontological model will be transferable, I think, to my PhD.
It would be nice if you could share, start your camera as well.
Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so before getting into the model, I'll briefly explain my research background within this topic. So during my MA dissertation at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, I came into contact with an unpublished shoulder lekithos depicting a solitary female figure reading. So I was able to associate it with an already named painter and found a large corpus of vases within the Beasley archive that also depicted female figures with scrolls. This led me to my independent research on the topic that I'm still currently working on, where I hope to publish 2 articles, an iconographical survey of female scroll iconography, and the contextualization of these scenes within the wider literacy iconography. And most recently, I presented an aspect of this research at the Computational Applications in Archaeology conference held in Athens, where basically I argued that there needs to be better standardization practices for describing iconographic metadata, particularly in terms of terminology consistency, image accessibility, and description quality. And as part of this, I created an ontoterminological dataset on TEDI, and going through this dataset will be my main aim for today. Okay, so as I mentioned, there really isn't a set way for describing iconography within an object record, so I had to create my own, which was done by combining the methods put forth in the following 2 publications. First is from Serviniu Inwood's Reading Greek Culture. Her main premise is to describe iconography in so much detail, near to the point of excess, in order to prevent bias over what aspects of the scene are important. However, Serviniu Inwood doesn't provide a practical way to implement this approach, so for that I turned to Stansbury O'Donnell's pictorial narrative in ancient Greek art. Here he looks at narrativity, or the storytelling of scenes depicted on vases, providing 2 approaches that should be performed in tandem. The first, looking at the functions of a narrative's microstructure, I find to be a bit convoluted and didn't really find his explanation helpful, but his second approach of looking at the elements of a pictorial narrative's macrostructure is more relevant. Here, Stansbury O'Donnell says we must look at the viewing process, viewing context, and visual languages presented by the painted scenes. And these macrostructure elements match up quite well with what I had previously identified as being important when describing iconography, so the action, dress, gestures, objects, setting, and scene types. So with my methodology now formulated, it's time to turn to TEDI, or the ontoterminology editor created by Professor Roche, which allows humanists to easily create and combine ontologies that are machine readable with terminologies that are human understandable. So with the help of a few of my colleagues, I figured out that for the most basic model, I needed to create 3 concept areas: a concept for literacy objects, one for figure identities, and one for the vases themselves. So what came easiest to me was creating a knowledge graph on the first topic of literacy objects. So because of my previous research, I knew that what was important for me was knowing how the relevant figures were interacting with the literacy objects. So there are 2 main literacy objects, scrolls and writing tablets, both of which had different levels of interaction. So scrolls primarily had 3 levels of interaction: active, semi-active, or semi-passive, and writing tablets had these levels of interaction as well as a 4th, which is passive. So then I also knew that whether these objects were depicted as open or closed was important, and in fact that helped me to the various levels of interaction. So then I had to figure out how to represent this knowledge graph within TEDI. So I first created a hierarchy of concepts, beginning with the concept of literacy object. So the subconcepts of scroll and writing tablet were then created by the function and type axes for analysis. And then for each of these concepts, further subconcepts were created based on their axes for analysis concerning state and interaction. Then, in order to be able to retain further information, I created attributes for the scroll concepts and attributes for the writing tablet concepts, which you can see on the slide here. So slightly more difficult for me to wrap my head around was my second concept concerning figure identity. From my previous research, I divided the figure identities as such: mortal female figures, mortal male figures, muses, and then gods, goddesses, and other mythical figures or creatures. So despite knowing that these were my end goal concepts, it was hard for me to figure out a way to actually distinguish between them, and I'm still not 100% happy with the result. In fact, when I input this concept hierarchy into TEDI, I did change it up quite a bit, but I still think it needs tweaking. I should also note that this knowledge graph and the subsequent TEDI concepts are incomplete, as I didn't include all of the possible identities, particularly of the immortal figures. For example, I know Athena, Nike, and satyrs are commonly depicted with literacy items. So in TEDI, this knowledge graph was represented as of right now with 17 different concepts. So to get to the most specific concepts within the hierarchy, I use the following axes of analysis in this order. So scene type, status, and identity. And then for the everyday figure concept, I then included two further differences: facial hair and inscription, while for the mythical figure concept, I included identification capability. Again, I don't have all of the concepts included right now, but rather prioritize the mortal female figures, including the named Sappho and the muses. And if I were to continue with this data model, I would add more concepts, again, particularly concerning the specific gods, goddesses, and other mythical figures. So as for the attributes for this concept group, I included clothing, direction facing, footwear, gestures, hairstyle, headwear, jewelry, and objects. Eventually, though, I probably would want to make these attributes into further concepts. And then the last concept I had to include for this model was related to the vases. Thankfully, though, I was able to use the article Mind the Gap written by Professors Roche and Papadopoulou as a starting point. In that article, they create an ontology for different craters based on their handles, necks, and feet. And so I similarly created an ontology based on vase structure, though here I began with the vase's mouth, as most vases are categorized first by whether they're open or closed vessels. So from this, I used vase size, lid presence, number, direction, and shape of handles, body shape, and foot presence to distinguish between the different vases. And these aspects were based on the vase information provided by a handbook published by the J. Paul Getty Museum. Once again, though, I'm not completely satisfied with how this turned out, so I might fix it in the future. And I definitely have more vases to add and more specific examples of these vases, these listed vases to include. So these vase structure aspects then became the basis for the axes of analysis for the concept, so I won't go over them again. But in addition to that, I also included the following attributes for the vase concept hierarchy. So we have attribution, meaning the painter, condition, whether the vase was whole, fragmented, or reconstructed, date, figures, meaning a list of the number of figures depicted in the scene, objects, again referring to all of the objects depicted in the scene, painting technique, publications, and scene interpretation. Some of these attributes, specifically attribution and scene interpretation, would probably become their own concepts if, again, I continued with this project. And so although I focused on only 3 concept areas at present, as I've mentioned, I have identified others that could be created in the future. So apart from the ones previously discussed, I could also create concepts for site, meaning the find location, and holding institution. Some of these seem straightforward in theory, but I think they may prove difficult when trying to structure them within TEDI, and that's chiefly why I left them out for now. So I'll briefly show you 2 exports from this TEDI data set, starting with the term dictionary. So on the left are all of the linguistic terms that I've created so far, though I'm sure I didn't include all of the relevant ones. Then on the right, you see the term that's been selected and all of its information. So for the term scroll, which is one of the more complete terms in this dictionary, it has the human understandable information in blue, then the machine readable one in green, and then the gray are all of the examples of scrolls that I've input. And then you can see that there's 52 different examples of this. And then you can also see if I can get it. You can see I did the same for identity terms such as female figure, and then again with the vase terms such as the shoulder lethithos. And then the other export is the object collection, which is a little more interesting and also more reminiscent of other databases like the Beasley Archive Pottery database. So here you can have each of the object examples, which don't just include the vases themselves, but also each individual figure depicted, as well as each literacy object. As you can see, though, right now I don't have a lot of images included because of copyright concerns. And that's also why I haven't asked to publish this with the other TALOS data sets. But if we go down to one of the more complete records, the NKUA Museum Lekithos, we can see how each object will be recorded. So first, for the vase itself, it includes information about the painter attribution, the condition of the vessel, its date, and further information about the figures, objects, and scene. Most importantly, though, it lists the other records connected to it, though unfortunately they aren't linked for easy navigability at this time. Then if we go to the figure record, you can see all of the dress and gesture information. And then similarly, when we go to the scroll, there's further information about the lettering and scroll shape. Okay. So after having created this model, I think I can better understand how I could create an ontology for my topic on Bronze Age Aegean female representations. To go back to what I mentioned in my first TALOS presentation, these were some of the aspects I wanted to create concepts for within TEDI. So to briefly recap, I separated the metadata into three categories: creation information, provenance information, and iconographical information. So these would form kind of the three overarching concepts, of which there would be various subconcepts. So based on the literacy iconography model, I think I have an idea on how to create four further subconcepts, and I've attempted a fifth. And I'll discuss these concepts in relation to the wall painting used once again in my first TALOS presentation, that of the saffron gatherers, because I've done more in-depth research on that example. So the first concept would be artifact, and I think it would follow the same kind of logic as that used when I created my vase concept. So basically, this concept would distinguish between the different types of media used in the representation of female figures. And since I have performed more research on wall paintings, I've been able to create further subconcepts based on the size of the figures within the wall paintings. I'm guessing I could do the same for sculpture, though I know, for example, within the figurine subconcept, I'll probably create additional ones, potentially based on material, for example, marble or clay, and or based on its cultural association, for example, cycladic, or body arrangement, for example, psi, phi, and taf. Liptics, I'm currently less sure how I'd further subdivide, while ceramics are again easier. I'm also unsure how I'll include linear B mentions of real life women. That will probably require a separate approach altogether. So then also mimicking the literacy iconography model, this ontology will also contain a concept hierarchy based around figure identity. However, I think that here this concept will be more challenging and require more thought. The scholarship for wall paintings already, though, has a pretty much agreed upon categorization for different ages of female figures that's primarily based on hairstyle, though other aspects such as chin, eyes, and chest can also be indicators. And I think that I'd probably be fine continuing to use that method here. But this approach is really only used for wall paintings. So how would I apply this for, say, figurines? Another issue is that I might need to include non-female figures as a concept because I'm pretty sure some of the miniature wall paintings depict male figures alongside female ones, and I think a similar case might crop up in the glyptics. Moreover, some female figures have been interpreted as more specific identities, for example, as goddesses or priestesses. However, these aren't as clear cut, so I'll have to figure out how to distinguish them as scholarly interpretations rather than totally agreed upon facts. So then another concept that I have been able to wrap my head around concerns dress, although by this I don't mean just the clothing, but also the hairstyle, jewelry, and makeup. This section, though, has its own host of issues, namely concerning preferred terminology. For clothing particularly, a lot of different terms used by scholars are meant to signify the same item, so I'll have to determine what should be the preferred term and what are less correct synonyms. I did find a particular scholar, Bernice R. Jones, who has a published sort of a handbook on Bronze Age Aegean clothing, so I might use the term she uses, or I might do a terminology audit to see what's used most by scholars. Hairstyles should be slightly easier and jewelry and makeup more so. It's also worth mentioning that wall paintings again depict these aspects quite clearly, but I have a feeling that some of the other artifact types might be harder to distinguish. For example, I don't think many figurines have discernible clothing, but rather use paint color and decoration as indicators. So then the next concept is that of objects, which will likely mirror the literacy object concept of before, where each object will be a concept with subconcepts based on level of interaction. For example, in the saffron gatherer's wall painting, there are baskets and crocus flowers. What will be difficult here, though, is one, to determine the different levels of interaction. So is there only active and passive, or are there in between levels as well? And then two, what objects will be viewed as objects and which will be viewed as part of the setting. And this is particularly in connection with the saffron flowers here. An additional concept I've started to think about for this project concerns the sites from which the artifacts were found. So here I know what kind of information is necessary, but I'll have to think further about the relationships and how to actually input them within TEDI. For example, the saffron gatherer's fresco is found on the east wall of the first floor level of room 3A in a building called Zesty 3 on Akrotiri on Thera. This will be easy to translate into concepts, but what I don't know how to do is create the actual relationships between different areas of the same building. For example, there are other areas within Zesty 3 that have wall paintings of female figures in association with saffron. So how will I be able to connect these through TEDI? And once again, there are many more concept hierarchies I'd like to include in the final product. Some of these will be more difficult than others. For example, I'm still unsure how I'll create concepts for gestures at the level at which I want to include them, as well as other interpretive information such as scene types and actions. Hopefully, as I do more research and collect more information, I'll be able to figure out a method for creating these sub-concepts, and I would also appreciate any suggestions. And then yesterday, I actually started to input more information on TEDI, which you can see here. So beginning with the concept editor, you can see the three overarching hierarchies I've created. And then here are some of the subconcepts. Um, Yeah, so and then I have to say I'm definitely going to need to change how this is organized, and I might need to create a different OTB in order to contain all of the information easily. For example, I need to figure out a better way to handle the location information, which I kind of mentioned before, because I need location for site found and then also for location held. And I'm sure there will be overlap in the concept, so I need to figure out how to actually handle that. And then also right now I have a separate concept for artifact material, but that might be unnecessary as it might be covered in artifact type. And then I've also started inputting objects within the object editor. So for each wall painting, which has again been my focus for right now, I'll have an object record for the entire wall painting, and then also records for individual records for each figure, their dress, their hairstyle, the objects they interact with, etc., as well as the room in which they were found. And so I'm again having particular trouble with the location information. I don't know how to arrange the concept hierarchy, like I've mentioned, and I don't know how to create the relationships among the different walls and rooms. I have, however, related the wall painting to the wall it's depicted on. So, for example, Saffron Gatherers is located in Zesty 3, Rome 3A, floor 1, east wall. So again, I have started inputting some relationships and attributes, which I can show here with the jewelry. But I haven't done it completely. I'll definitely have to add more. And I haven't started working on the linguistic dimension at all, but I think I've gotten a good start to this. So then with all that being said, I think I have a better idea on how to move forward. First, I need to continue collecting information for more examples. I'll likely carry on with wall paintings, at least for a handful of examples, if not all of the known relevant instances, and then move on to other artifact types. Then through reading this scholarship and more specialized ones, I'll create a list of preferred terms and common synonyms. Next, I'll create knowledge graphs when needed to wrap my head around the concept hierarchies. And then finally, I'll record this information on TEDI. And again, of course, during this process, I'll work on writing the thesis so I don't forget my methodology for inputting this information. So thank you for your time, and I'd be welcome to any suggestions on how to continue with my ontology, particularly the concepts I haven't yet wrapped my head around. So thank you.